The winter of 1851 settled over Virginia like a shroud. Snow blanketed the tobacco fields in deceptive beauty, each flake catching moonlight as it fell. But beneath that pristine white surface, the earth remembered. It remembered the blood, the tears, the countless footsteps of those who walked in chains. December nights in the plantation country carried a particular kind of cold. Not just the bite of winter air, but something deeper, something that crept into your bones and stayed there. The enslaved quarters huddled against the wind, thin walls offering little protection from either the weather or the cruelty that never slept. Christmas was coming. For some, this meant warmth and celebration. For others, it meant nothing had changed at all. In the dim light of a dying fire, Sarah sat motionless on her narrow cot. Her hands, scarred from years of labor, rested in her lap like two weathered stones. Around her, the other women whispered prayers or mended clothes by candlelight. But Sarah remained silent. She had been silent for so long that some forgot she could speak at all. Her eyes told a different story. Dark and unblinking, they reflected the ember glow like pools of still water hiding dangerous depths. When others looked at her, they felt something shift in their stomachs, a warning, a recognition of something they couldn't name. The overseer's bell had rung hours ago, signaling the end of another brutal day. But sleep would not come to Sarah. It hadn't come easily for months now. Instead, she sat and listened, to the wind rattling the shutters, to the distant laughter spilling from the big house windows, to the soft sobbing of Clara, the girl who worked in the kitchen and still believed things might get better. Sarah knew better. She had seen 26 winters on this plantation, 26 Christmas seasons where the master's family feasted while the quarters went hungry, 26 years of watching cruel men grow crueler, of seeing good people broken like dry kindling, 26 years of biting her tongue until it bled. But something had changed in the darkness of her heart. Something had shifted like a stone finally giving way after years of pressure. The other women whispered that Sarah dreamed of fire now. They weren't wrong. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling all sound except for the occasional crack of settling wood and the distant howl of wind through bare branches. The big house sat like a monument to suffering, its windows glowing, with warmth that would never touch the quarters. In one of those bright windows, a shadow moved. Master's eldest son, home from college for the holidays. Sarah had watched him grow from a spoiled boy into something worse. His younger brother wasn't far behind. Both of them had their father's eyes, cold, calculating, and entirely without mercy. Sarah's fingers tightened into fists. For a moment, the dying fire seemed to flicker brighter, as if responding to something stirring within her. The other women didn't notice. They were lost in their own private prayers and sorrows. But the fire noticed. It danced a little higher, casting Sarah's shadow long and dark against the cabin wall. And in that shadow, something patient and terrible began to take shape. Something that had been waiting through 26 winters for its moment to breathe. Christmas. Eve was 3 days away. Time enough for planning. Time enough for gathering what she would need. Time enough for the kind of silence that comes before thunder. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows like skeletal fingers. And somewhere in the distance, so faint it might have been imagination, came the sound of something burning. The big house stood like a monument to stolen wealth, its white columns gleaming even in the pale December light. From the outside, it appeared grand and welcoming. Red ribbons adorned the front door, garlands of pine draped the windows, warm light spilled from every room, promising comfort and joy. But appearances, Sarah knew, were the cruelest lies of all. Inside, those walls lived the master, a man whose name was spoken only in whispers, and never with anything but fear. Thomas Whitmore had inherited this plantation from his father, along with the belief that human beings could be owned like cattle. 3 decades of absolute power had twisted him into something barely recognizable as human. The whiskey didn't help. By noon most days, his voice carried the slur of drink, and by evening, his temper turned explosive. Sarah had seen him strike a man unconscious for looking at him the wrong way. She had watched him sell children away from their mothers for the crime of crying too loudly. But it was his sons who truly made her blood run cold. James the elder had returned from the University of Virginia with refined manners and educated words that made his cruelty seem almost civilized. He spoke of philosophy and literature while describing human beings as property. He could quote scripture while ordering beatings. At 22, he had already mastered the art of inflicting suffering with a smile. His younger brother William wasn't far behind. At 19, he lacked James's polish but made up for it with raw viciousness. Where James calculated his cruelty, William simply enjoyed it. Both brothers saw the enslaved as playthings, objects to amuse them when boredom struck, and boredom struck often during their long winter break. Sarah moved through the house like a ghost, carrying trays, lighting fires, appearing when summoned, and vanishing when dismissed. Her bare feet made no sound on the polished floors. Her presence was acknowledged only when someone needed something from her. She had perfected the art of being invisible while seeing everything. The dining room table groaned under the weight of preparation for Christmas dinner. Silver candlesticks that could feed a family for months. China plates painted with delicate flowers. Crystal glasses that caught the light like tiny prisons. All of it purchased with money earned by breaking human backs. In the kitchen, Sarah watched the cook, a woman named Maddie whose hands shook from years of burns and cuts, prepare a feast that would feed 3 men while 40 souls in the quarters shared scraps and hope. "Sarah," Maddie whispered when the others weren't looking. "You got that look again. That look that makes me worry." Sarah said nothing. She simply continued kneading bread dough, her movements mechanical and precise. But Maddie wasn't wrong. Something in Sarah's face had changed over the past few months. The blankness remained, but underneath it, something else was building. Something patient and terrible. From the parlor came the sound of laughter. Master Whitmore was telling his sons a story about a runaway he'd caught years before. The details were too horrible to repeat, but the laughter that followed each grotesque detail echoed through the house like the sound of breaking glass. Sarah's hands never paused in their kneading, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Later, that evening, as she carried wood to the fireplaces throughout the house, she lingered for a moment in the parlor doorway. The 3 men sat around the fire, glasses of brandy in their hands, faces flushed with drink and warmth. They spoke of their plans for Christmas dinner, of guests who would come to admire their fine home and prosperous plantation. None of them noticed Sarah standing in the shadows, watching. None of them saw how her eyes reflected the firelight like dark mirrors. None of them realized that while they spoke of their future feast, she was already planning their last meal. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10 times. Bedtime for the master and his sons. They would sleep in warm beds, behind locked doors, believing themselves safe in their fortress of wealth and power. But Sarah knew something they didn't. She knew that every fortress had weak points. Every fire needed only the right kindling to become an inferno. Christmas Eve was now 2 days away. Time to begin gathering what she would need. The next morning arrived gray and bitter, with ice forming on the windows like skeletal fingers reaching inward. Sarah rose before dawn, as she had every day for 26 years. But today felt different. Today, her movements carried a purpose that went beyond mere survival. In the pre-dawn darkness, she began to collect small things. Nothing that would be missed, nothing that would draw attention. A bit of lamp oil from the kitchen, some cotton, rags from the sewing room, strips of cloth torn from garments too worn to mend. Each item disappeared into hidden pockets, secreted away like fragments of a larger plan only she could see. The other enslaved people sensed something had changed. In Sarah, though none could say exactly what. She had always been quiet, but now her silence felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. When she looked at the big house, her gaze lingered too long on the windows. When she tended the fireplaces, her hands moved with unusual care around the kindling. Old Moses, who had worked these fields longer than anyone could remember, watched her with knowing eyes. He had seen rebellion before. He had seen the quiet fury that built in the hearts of those who had endured too much. Most of the time, it burned itself out in tears or prayers. Sometimes it didn't. "Child," he whispered to her as they passed in the yard, "be careful what fires you light. Some flames burn everything in their path." Sarah met his gaze for just a moment. In her eyes, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Not madness. That would have been easier to understand. What he saw was clarity. The terrible, absolute clarity of someone who had already decided their fate. Throughout the day, Sarah continued her preparations. She knew every inch of the big house, every weak board, every draft that could fan flames. She had spent 26 years studying her prison, and now that knowledge would serve a different purpose. In the storage room beneath the kitchen, she found what she was looking for. Barrels of lamp oil, stored for the long winter months. Enough to turn wood and fabric into an inferno. Her fingers traced the wooden staves, calculating quantities, planning paths. The master's sons would be drinking heavily on Christmas Eve. Their father would join them, as he always did. By midnight, they would be deep in drunken sleep, doors locked, windows closed against the cold. Perfect conditions for what she had in mind. As evening approached, Sarah found herself in the parlor again, lighting candles and tending the fire while the three men discussed their holiday plans. James was expecting a young woman to visit, the daughter of a neighboring planter, someone he intended to court. William spoke of the hunting party they would host. Master Whitmore simply drank and nodded, his attention focused more on the brandy than the conversation. "Sarah," James called suddenly, and she froze. Had he noticed something? Did he suspect? "The fire's getting low," he said without even looking at her. "Add more wood, and make sure the dampers open properly. The smoke was bothering Father earlier." She nodded and moved to the fireplace, her heart hammering against her ribs. As she knelt, to arrange the logs, she studied the flue, the draft patterns, the way the flames danced up the chimney. Every detail mattered. Every weakness was a weapon waiting to be used. "Clumsy girl," William muttered, as she accidentally scattered ash across the hearth. "Clean that up properly." Sarah swept the ash into her palm, but instead of disposing of it, she let some fall into her apron pocket. Even ashes had their uses in what she was planning. That night, alone in her cabin, she laid out her collected materials like a general preparing for battle. Oil-soaked rags, strips of cotton, small bottles of lamp fuel, everything arranged with careful precision. The other women slept around her, exhausted by another day of back-breaking labor. But Sarah remained awake, her mind working through every detail of what was to come. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. The last Christmas Eve the Whitmore family would ever see. In the darkness, Sarah's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, if smiles could carry the weight of 26 years of fury. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, but those embers still held heat, still held potential, just like Sarah herself. Christmas Eve arrived with a stillness that felt unnatural. No wind stirred the bare branches. No snow fell from the leaden sky. Even the usual sounds of the plantation seemed muffled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sarah rose before dawn and went about her duties with the same quiet efficiency she had shown for 26 years. She prepared breakfast for the big house. She swept floors and dusted furniture. She lit fires in every room, her hands steady as she arranged kindling and struck matches. To anyone watching, She appeared exactly as she always had. Invisible, obedient, broken. But beneath that familiar mask, something else was stirring. Something that had been building through months of sleepless nights and swallowed rage. Something that was finally ready to be born. The Whitmore men spent the day as they always did during holidays, in idle luxury. Master Whitmore settled into his chair with a bottle of his finest whiskey. James read poetry aloud, his voice carrying the educated refinement that made his cruelty seem almost civilized. William cleaned his hunting rifles, occasionally firing, practice shots that echoed across the fields like thunder. None of them paid attention to Sarah as she moved through their house. None of them noticed how her eyes lingered on certain details, the heavy drapes that would burn like tinder, the narrow hallways that would channel flames, the wooden floors she had polished to a mirror shine. None of them realized that their faithful servant was mapping their tomb. As evening fell, the feast began, roasted turkey and glazed ham, sweet potatoes candied with brown sugar, pies and cakes that filled the dining room with the smell of cinnamon and nutmeg. 3 men gorging themselves while 40 souls in the quarters made do with scraps and bitter cold. Sarah served each course in silence, refilling glasses and clearing plates. She watched the master grow redder with drink. She watched his sons become louder, more boastful, more cruel in their casual comments about the property that served them. She watched and remembered and felt the fire in her chest burn hotter, with each passing moment. By 10 o'clock, the feast was ending. Master Whitmore had consumed enough whiskey to fell a horse. James was reciting drunken poetry to the ceiling. William was polishing his pistol with the unsteady hands of someone who had drunk far too much brandy. "Sarah," the master slurred, waving his glass in her direction. "More whiskey. The good bottle. The one with the wax seal." She brought the bottle from the cabinet, her movements careful and deliberate. As she poured, some of the amber liquid splashed onto the table and she made no move to clean it. Let it soak into the wood. Let it wait for the spark that would turn it into fuel. "That's enough," James declared, pushing back from the table. "I'm for bed. Too much wine makes the head heavy." One by one, they stumbled upstairs to their rooms. Sarah heard the sound of doors slamming, locks clicking into place. The master's snores began almost immediately, deep, rattling sounds that carried through the floorboards. Within minutes, the entire house had settled into the deep quiet of drunken sleep. Now was the time. Sarah moved like smoke through the darkened house. In the kitchen, she retrieved the materials she had hidden: bottles of lamp oil, bundles of oil-soaked rags, strips of cotton that would catch fire like lightning. She began in the parlor, where the evening's fire still glowed in the hearth. She soaked the heavy drapes with oil, watching the expensive fabric drink it in hungrily. The dining room was next. Oil across the polished floors, pooling around the legs of chairs and table. The rags stuffed into corners where flames could take hold and spread. The wooden wainscoting painted with fuel until it gleamed like water in the moonlight. She worked in perfect silence, her feet making no sound on the floor she had walked for 26 years. Every room received her attention. Every escape route was cut off. Every weakness in the house's construction became a path for the fire to follow. In the hallway outside the bedrooms, she paused. Behind those locked doors, 3 men slept in drunken peace. They had no idea that their faithful servant had just turned their fortress into a tinderbox. They had no idea that 26 years of swallowed rage was about to speak in a language they would finally understand. Sarah returned to the parlor and knelt before the dying fire. Her hand was steady as she lit the first oil-soaked rag. Flame caught with a hungry whoosh, burning brighter and hotter than any hearth fire. She touched it to the drapes. The heavy fabric exploded into flame. Within seconds, the fire was racing up the walls, across the ceiling, spreading with impossible speed through rooms soaked in lamp oil. The house filled with light and heat and the roar of hungry flames. Smoke poured through the hallways, seeping under locked bedroom doors. From upstairs came the first confused shouts, then screams of panic as the master and his sons realized their predicament. Footsteps pounded across the floor, fists hammered against doors that wouldn't open, windows that wouldn't break. But Sarah was already outside, standing in the snow, watching her life's work bloom into perfect, terrible flower. The big house burned like a torch against the night sky. Flames reached toward the stars, carrying with them 26 years of silence, transformed into an inferno that could be seen for miles. Behind her she heard voices from the quarters, people awakening to the glow, emerging to witness what she had done. Some wept, some prayed, some simply stared in awe at the power of a single woman's fury made manifest. The screaming from inside the house gradually faded to nothing. Dawn broke over a landscape transformed. Where the big house had stood for 3 generations, only blackened timbers and crumbling stone remained. Smoke still rose from the ruins, carrying the acrid smell of burned wood and worse things that nobody wanted to name. The snow around the foundation had melted, leaving dark puddles that reflected the gray sky like hollow eyes. Sarah was gone. Some claimed they saw her silhouette against the flames until the very end, standing motionless, as a statue while the house collapsed around her. Others swore they glimpsed her walking toward the woods as the fire reached its peak, her figure disappearing between the trees like smoke itself. By the time neighboring planters arrived with buckets and desperate hopes of saving something, there was nothing left to save. Thomas Whitmore and his sons had been trapped in their rooms, overcome by smoke and flame before they could break free. The intense heat had left little behind, just enough to confirm that the master's family was gone. Forever. The investigation, such as it was, focused on finding someone to blame. The local sheriff questioned every enslaved person on the plantation, looking for signs of conspiracy or rebellion. But the quarters had their own code of silence, older and stronger than any law. Nobody had seen anything unusual. Nobody had heard any plans. Sarah had simply vanished, like a dream that fades with morning light. Could have been an accident, one neighbor suggested, standing among the ruins. Old house, dry wood, sparks from the chimney. But others shook their heads. The fire had burned too hot, spread too fast. The pattern of destruction suggested something more deliberate. Someone had wanted this house to burn completely, with no chance of escape for those inside. Within days, the rumors began to spread. Some said Sarah had been caught trying to flee and was hanged from the nearest tree, though no body was ever found and no witness stepped forward. Others claimed she had died in the flames herself, consumed by the very fire she had set. A few whispered that she had been seen walking north along the old tobacco road, following the path that other runaways had taken toward freedom. The truth became secondary to the story, and the story grew with each telling. In slave quarters across Virginia, Sarah's name began to carry weight. Her fire became legend, her silence transformed into something approaching reverence. Some said she had been touched by the hand of divine justice. Others believed she had made a bargain with darker powers. All agreed that she had done what others only dreamed of. She had made her masters pay for their cruelty. The white community preferred different explanations. Sarah became a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting those in bondage. Her story was used to justify harsher punishments, tighter controls, more frequent searches of the quarters. Fear bred more fear, creating exactly the kind of tension that made future Sarahs inevitable. But in the evenings, when work was done and the overseers had returned to their own homes, the enslaved people told different stories. They spoke of a woman who had endured 26 years of hell before finding the strength to burn her way out. They whispered that her spirit still walked the plantation roads, bringing courage to those who needed it most. The Whitmore plantation was eventually sold to pay debts. The new owners built a modest house well away from the original foundation. But they never could keep servants for long. People claimed the land itself remembered what had happened there. They said that on certain nights, when the wind was right, you could still smell smoke in the air. And sometimes, just sometimes, they swore they could see a woman walking through the ruins, her eyes reflecting flames that would never die. Expanded script, approximately 500 words. Years passed, then decades. The Civil War came and went, bringing with it the end of legal slavery, but not the end of suffering. Reconstruction rose and fell. The old plantation system transformed into something else, but the scars remained, in the land, in the people, in the stories they carried forward. Sarah's tale evolved with each generation that told it. The details changed, embellished by time and imagination, but the core remained the same. A woman pushed beyond endurance, finding her breaking point on a cold Christmas Eve, and choosing fire as her answer to a lifetime of chains. In some versions, she escaped to the north and lived to old age, her fire lighting the path for others seeking freedom. In others, she died in the flames she created, her spirit rising with the smoke, to watch over those who still suffered. The most chilling stories claimed she never died at all, that she became something beyond human, a force of vengeance that wandered Virginia's back roads on winter nights. Children born in freedom learned her name before they could properly spell it. Adults who had lived through slavery spoke it with a mixture of fear and pride. Sarah had done what they all dreamed of, but few dared attempt. She had turned her master's power against him, using his own weapons, fire, violence, the assumption of her powerlessness, to achieve what no law or appeal to conscience could accomplish. The ruins of the Whitmore house became a pilgrimage, site of sorts. People would visit the blackened foundation stones, now covered with creeping vines and wild flowers. Some came to pray, others came to remember. A few came seeking courage for their own impossible battles. Local historians tried to separate fact from legend, but the task proved futile. Too much time had passed. Too many voices had added their own details to the story. Sarah had become something larger than any one person. She had become the embodiment of resistance itself, the proof that even the most powerless could find ways to strike back. On Christmas Eves, when snow covered the Virginia countryside and firelight flickered in windows across the land, some people still told her story. Parents warned children about the dangers of accumulated rage. Grandparents spoke of justice taking forms that law and society would never recognize. And sometimes, when the night was particularly cold and the wind carried strange sounds, even skeptics found themselves glancing toward the shadows. They say that if you visit the old plantation site on a winter night, you might catch the scent of smoke where no fire burns. You might see a figure moving between the trees, her eyes reflecting light that has no source. You might hear the whisper of footsteps on paths that lead nowhere, followed by the distant sound of flames crackling in the darkness. Whether Sarah found freedom or death, whether she was saint or sinner, hero or criminal, these questions matter less than what she represents. In a world built on the powerlessness of some to serve the comfort of others, she proved that silence could hold fury, and that even the smallest spark, given the right conditions, could bring down kingdoms built on cruelty. Her fire still burns, in every heart that refuses to accept injustice, in every spirit that chooses defiance over submission, in every match struck against the darkness, hoping to kindle something better from the ashes of what was. The story ends, but the flame continues. Always.